They told her he was dying. The paramedics said his pulse was fading, that the impact had been too severe, that she should prepare herself for the worst. Rain hammered against the twisted metal of what used to be a $60,000 Mercedes, and somewhere in the chaos of flashing lights and urgent voices, Rebecca Chen knelt beside her husband's broken body and whispered the words she'd been holding back for 3 years. Words that would have destroyed him if he could hear them. But Marcus wasn't supposed to be listening. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, blood trickling from a gash above his temple. The accident had been brutal. A hydroplaning semi-truck, a guardrail that gave way like paper, and a 30-foot drop that should have killed them both. Rebecca had crawled out with just a few cuts. Marcus hadn't been so lucky. Or so everyone thought. What nobody knew, what even the EMTs rushing around them couldn't detect, was that behind those closed eyelids, Marcus Chen was fully conscious. Trapped in his own body, unable to move or speak, but aware of every sound, every touch, every devastating word his wife was about to say. The story of how they got there begins 18 months earlier, in a penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor. Marcus had just closed a deal that would add another $200 million to his portfolio, making him one of the youngest self-made billionaires in New England. He'd built his empire from nothing. The son of immigrants who ran a laundromat in Queens, he'd worked his way through MIT, launched a fintech startup at 24, and sold it for his first billion by 32. Now at 35, he had everything the world said a man should want. Except he didn't have his wife's heart anymore. And somewhere deep down, he knew it. Rebecca had been his college sweetheart, the girl who believed in him when he was coding in coffee shops and eating ramen for dinner. She'd stood by him through the 18-hour workdays, the failed pitches, the moments when bankruptcy seemed inevitable. She'd been his partner, his anchor, his reason to keep fighting. But success has a way of changing people, or maybe it just reveals who they always were. The private jets and charity galas and magazine covers had created distance between them, the kind that grows so slowly you don't notice until you're standing on opposite sides of a canyon. The night of the accident, they'd been driving back from his company's annual gala. Marcus had spent most of the evening networking, barely speaking to Rebecca except to introduce her to investors and board members. She'd smiled through it all, elegant in her navy dress, playing the role of the supportive wife while something inside her quietly broke. They'd argued in the car, the kind of argument that's really about everything and nothing at the same time. He'd accused her of being distant. She'd accused him of forgetting why they got married in the first place. The rain had started as light drizzle but quickly became a downpour, and Marcus had been driving too fast, too angry, too distracted by his own frustration to notice the truck ahead, losing control. The impact happened in slow motion, and all at once, metal screaming, glass exploding, the sickening sensation of falling. Then darkness. When Marcus opened his eyes, he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even twitch a finger. But he could hear everything. The rain, the sirens, Rebecca's panic breathing as she crawled to his side of the car. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their voices professional and urgent. Rebecca was crying now, her hands shaking as she touched Marcus's face. One of the EMTs gently pulled her back, checking Marcus's vitals, speaking in the calm but serious tone they reserve for critical situations. That's when Marcus heard his wife's voice, barely above a whisper, words meant only for him, words she thought he'd never hear. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry for what I've done." His mind screamed at his body to respond, to open his eyes, to squeeze her hand, anything. But nothing worked. He was a prisoner in his own flesh, forced to listen as his wife continued. "I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could stop before it became real. But I couldn't. I fell in love with him, Marcus. I fell in love with someone else, and I don't know how to tell you. I don't know how to break your heart when you've already given me everything." The words hit him harder than the crash had. Michael. She had to be talking about Michael Davidson, his business partner, the guy who'd been his friend since their startup days. Marcus had noticed the way they laughed together at company events, the inside jokes, the comfortable familiarity. But he dismissed it as paranoia, as his own guilt for neglecting her manifesting as unfounded jealousy. Now lying here unable to move, unable to confront her, he realized his instincts had been right all along. Rebecca's voice cracked as she continued. "The doctor said you might not make it. If you can hear me somehow, if there's any part of you still in there, I need you to know this wasn't about the money or the lifestyle. It was about feeling seen again, about remembering what it's like to matter to someone, not as a trophy or an accessory, but as a person." An EMT interrupted, telling Rebecca they needed to transport Marcus immediately. She squeezed his hand one more time, and Marcus felt it, the warmth of her touch, the wedding ring he'd placed on her finger 7 years ago pressing against his palm. Then they were loading him onto a stretcher, and the world became a blur of movement and noise. During the ambulance ride, Marcus focused every ounce of mental energy on trying to move something, anything, a finger twitch, an eyelid flutter. But his body refused to cooperate. The condition he was experiencing, though he didn't know it yet, was called locked-in syndrome, a rare neurological state where a person is conscious and can think and reason, but cannot move or speak, because nearly all voluntary muscles are paralyzed. It can last hours, days, or in the worst cases, become permanent. For Marcus, every second felt like an eternity. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly. CT scans, X-rays, blood tests. Rebecca waited in a private room, her mother flying in from California, Marcus's parents making their way down from New York. The prognosis was unclear: traumatic brain injury, severe but not necessarily fatal. The next 48 hours would be critical. During those 2 days, Marcus existed in a strange purgatory. He could hear conversations around him, doctors discussing his condition, nurses checking his vitals, Rebecca talking to family members in hushed tones. She never repeated her confession, never mentioned Michael. Instead, she told stories about their early days together, memories Marcus had almost forgotten, the time they got lost in Rome and ended up at a tiny restaurant where the owner insisted on serenading them. The night he proposed on a beach in Maine, so nervous he dropped the ring in the sand, and they spent 20 minutes searching for it with their phone flashlights. The morning she found out she was pregnant, 3 years into their marriage, and how they'd cried together with joy and terror. That detail struck Marcus like lightning. Pregnant, but there was no child. What had happened? He strained to remember, to piece together the timeline, but the memories were fragmented, obscured by years of prioritizing work over everything else. Rebecca's voice became softer as she spoke to him alone one night. "I lost the baby, Marcus, at 12 weeks. You were in Singapore closing the Tanaka deal. I called you crying and you said you'd catch the next flight home, but then the deal started falling apart and you stayed another week. My sister took me to the hospital for the procedure. You sent flowers." There was no anger in her voice, just a profound sadness that made Marcus's paralyzed heart ache. "I think that's when I started disappearing. Not physically, but the part of me that believed we were a team. That believed I mattered as much as your company did. I became furniture in our life, beautiful and expensive and easy to overlook." The confession continued, painting a picture Marcus had been too blind or too busy to see. Rebecca had thrown herself into volunteer work, joining the board of a nonprofit that provided microloans to women entrepreneurs. That's where she'd met Michael. Not his business partner Michael, but Michael Torres, a social worker who ran programs for at-risk youth. Someone who had time for long conversations over coffee. Someone who asked about her dreams and actually listened to the answers. Someone who made her feel like she existed beyond the shadow of her husband's success. On the third day, something changed. Marcus felt a tingling in his right index finger. It was subtle, barely there, but it was something. He focused all his attention on that finger, willing it to move. Hours passed. Then, during an evening visit from Rebecca, he managed it. A tiny twitch, almost imperceptible. But Rebecca was holding his hand, and she felt it. She gasped, pressing the call button for the nurse. He moved. His finger moved. The medical staff came rushing in, running tests, checking responses. Slowly, gradually, Marcus began to emerge from his prison. First the finger movements, then the ability to flutter his eyelids, then finally, after what felt like an eternity but was only 6 days, the ability to speak. His first word was hoarse, barely audible. "Rebecca." She burst into tears, gripping his hand so tightly it hurt. But Marcus welcomed the pain. It meant he was alive. It meant he could feel. It meant he had a chance to save what was left of his life. The doctors called it a miracle. Locked-in syndrome patients rarely recovered so quickly or so completely. Within 2 weeks, Marcus was sitting up in bed, relearning how to use his body. The physical recovery was challenging, but the emotional recovery was even harder, because now Marcus had to decide what to do with the truth he'd learned. He didn't confront Rebecca immediately. Instead, he watched her, really watched her, in ways he hadn't in years. He noticed how tired she looked, dark circles under her eyes from days of sleeping in hospital chairs. He noticed the way she carefully chose her words, as if afraid of saying too much or too little. He noticed the phone calls she took in the hallway, the way her voice changed when she spoke to someone whose name she never mentioned. One afternoon, Marcus's business partner, the other Michael, visited the hospital. He brought news about the company, quarterly reports, upcoming deals. But Marcus barely heard him. He was too busy watching Rebecca's face when Michael entered the room, looking for signs of the affair she'd confessed to. But there were none. She was polite, but distant, professional. After Michael left, Marcus asked her directly, "Are you having an affair with him?" Rebecca's eyes went wide with shock. What? With Michael? No, Marcus, absolutely not. Why would you even think that? Marcus studied her face, looking for deception, but all he saw was genuine confusion. That's when he realized he'd made an assumption in his paralyzed state, filling in blanks based on his own insecurities. You said you fell in love with someone else, in the car, after the accident. You thought I couldn't hear you, but I heard everything. The color drained from Rebecca's face. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she sat down heavily in a chair beside his bed, her hands trembling. You heard that. It wasn't a question. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. His name is Michael Torres. He's not wealthy or powerful or connected to your world at all. He's a social worker. I met him at the nonprofit. We started talking, and talking became coffee, and coffee became lunches. And before I knew it, I was sharing things with him I hadn't shared with you in years. My fears, my dreams, my grief over the baby we lost. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stay quiet to let her finish. We kissed once, just once, about 2 months ago, and I immediately knew I couldn't do it. Not because I was afraid of getting caught, but because despite everything, despite the distance and the loneliness and the feeling that I'd become invisible in my own marriage, I still love you. I still chose you. She reached for his hand, and this time Marcus didn't pull away. I broke it off that same day, told Michael it was a mistake, that I needed to either fix my marriage or end it, honestly. But I wasn't going to be the kind of person who lives a lie. I haven't spoken to him since except for one email where I resigned from the nonprofit board. And then the accident happened, and I thought I was going to lose you before I ever had the chance to tell you the truth or try to make things right. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment. Marcus looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw something he'd been missing for years. Not the polished, elegant woman who stood beside him at charity events, but the girl he'd fallen in love with in a crowded lecture hall. The woman who'd believed in him when he had nothing but dreams and determination. I stopped seeing you, he said finally. Not just you. I stopped seeing anything except spreadsheets and stock prices and the next deal. I built an empire and forgot why I was building it in the first place. Rebecca's tears fell freely now. I should have told you how I was feeling. Should have fought harder for us instead of finding comfort somewhere else. But I was so tired, Marcus. Tired of competing with your phone, your meanings, your entire world that didn't seem to have room for me anymore. They talked for hours that night. The kind of raw, honest conversation they hadn't had in years. Marcus told her about the pressure he felt to keep succeeding, to prove he wasn't just lucky but deserving of his wealth and status. How he had convinced himself that providing financially was the same as being present. How he'd buried his own pain over losing their baby and work because he didn't know how else to cope. Rebecca told him about the emptiness she'd felt watching their life become something unrecognizable. About the guilt of having everything most people dreamed of and still feeling profoundly alone. 3 months later, Marcus made a decision that shocked everyone in his circle. He stepped back from day-to-day operations of his company, appointing a CEO he trusted and moving into a chairman role that required a fraction of his previous time commitment. He sold the penthouse and bought a smaller house in a quiet suburb outside Boston, a place with a yard and neighbors who didn't know or care about his net worth. Rebecca was skeptical at first, afraid it was a grand gesture that would fade once he got bored with ordinary life. But Marcus was patient. He showed up for breakfast every morning. He learned to cook badly at first, but improving. He asked about her day and actually listened to the answers. He went to therapy, both individually and with Rebecca, working through the patterns that had nearly destroyed their marriage. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, arguments, nights when old habits resurfaced and Marcus found himself checking work emails at midnight, or Rebecca pulled away emotionally, afraid to trust that the changes would last. But they kept showing up for each other, kept choosing to fight for what they'd almost lost. One evening, almost a year after the accident, they were sitting on their back porch watching the sunset. Rebecca had her head on Marcus's shoulder and he was absently playing with her hair, something he used to do when they were young and broke and happy. Do you ever regret it? Rebecca asked quietly. Stepping away from everything you built? Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. Sometimes I miss the adrenaline of closing a big deal, the rush of seeing something I created succeed beyond my wildest expectations. But then I come home to you, and I remember what success actually looks like. It's not a number in a bank account or a magazine profile. It's this. It's having someone who knows me completely, flaws and all, and chooses to stay anyway. It's building a life that matters in ways money can't measure. Rebecca lifted her head to look at him, and he saw tears in her eyes. I'm proud of us, she said, for not giving up, for doing the hard work instead of taking the easy way out. Marcus kissed her forehead. I almost lost you. I was lying there in that car, unable to move or speak, listening to you confess something that should have destroyed me. And instead, it saved me. It made me realize that I'd already lost you in all the ways that actually mattered, long before that accident. The crash just made it impossible to keep pretending everything was fine. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from pink to purple to deep blue. Somewhere in the neighborhood, children were laughing, someone was grilling dinner, a dog barked in the distance. It was ordinary and imperfect, and more valuable than anything Marcus's billions could buy. 6 months after that conversation, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant again. This time, Marcus didn't miss a single appointment. He held her hand during the ultrasounds, assembled the crib himself despite having no idea what he was doing, and when their daughter Emma was born on a snowy January morning, he was the first to hold her. Looking down at his daughter's tiny face, Marcus thought about the man he'd been before the accident, so focused on building an empire that he'd nearly lost his kingdom. He thought about the wife who'd loved him enough to stay, even when staying was the hardest choice she could make. He thought about second chances and what it means to truly live instead of just survive. Emma wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest. This was his legacy, not the company or the wealth or the reputation. This small person, this family, this life built on honesty and hard work, and showing up even when it's uncomfortable. That's what would matter when everything else faded away. Rebecca walked over, still exhausted from labor but radiant, and leaned against Marcus's shoulder to look at their daughter. "She's perfect," Rebecca whispered. "She is," Marcus agreed, "just like her mother." Rebecca laughed softly. "I'm far from perfect. We both are, but we're perfect for each other, flaws and all." As they stood there, new parents holding their miracle baby, Marcus couldn't help but think back to that rainy night when everything changed. To the moment when he'd heard his wife's confession and realized his life had become something he didn't recognize. To the long road back to each other, paved with difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths, and the daily choice to prioritize their relationship over everything else competing for their attention. The accident had broken his body but saved his soul, and the wife who'd whispered her secrets in what she thought was his final moment had given him the greatest gift of all. The truth, painful as it was, that set them both free to build something real. Years from now, Marcus knew they'd tell Emma about the accident that almost took her father's life, but they'd also tell her about what came after, the hard work of rebuilding, the courage it takes to be honest, even when honesty is terrifying, and the profound beauty of a love that survives its own near destruction. Because that's the thing about true partnerships. They're not built in the easy moments when everything is going well. They're forged in the fire of difficulty, in the choice to stay when leaving would be simpler, in the willingness to look at your own failures and do better. As Marcus watched his daughter sleep in his arms, he made a silent promise. He'd be present. He'd show up. He'd remember that success isn't measured in dollars or deals or magazine covers, but in the small, sacred moments that make up a life. Breakfast conversations and sunset walks and the weight of a child sleeping safely in your arms. That night, after Rebecca and Emma were both asleep, Marcus stood at the window of their hospital room looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were chasing the same things he'd once chased. Wealth, status, achievement, the next big win, and he didn't judge them for it. He'd walked that path and understood its appeal, but he also knew its cost. He knew how easy it is to lose yourself in pursuit of success, to sacrifice the things that matter most on the altar of ambition. His phone buzzed with a message from his company's new CEO. Another successful quarter, revenue up 20%, a potential acquisition on the horizon. Marcus read the message, felt a flicker of the old excitement, then put the phone away and walked back to his sleeping family. Tomorrow he'd respond, engage with the business decisions that still required his input. But tonight belonged to love and life and the quiet miracle of second chances. Because that's what he had learned in those terrifying moments of paralysis, listening to his wife's confession and realizing he'd nearly lost everything that actually mattered. You can build an empire or you can build a life. And if you're very lucky and very brave, you figure out how to do both without sacrificing one for the other. So what would you do in Rebecca's position? Could you find the strength to stay and fight for a marriage that seemed broken beyond repair? And what about Marcus? If you heard your partner confess to falling in love with someone else, could you move past it and rebuild trust? These aren't easy questions, but they're the ones that define us. Love isn't just about the romantic moments or the grand gestures. It's about the choice you make every single day to show up, to be honest, to do the work even when it's uncomfortable. It's about recognizing that perfection isn't the goal, connection is. As Marcus had learned the hard way, you can have all the money in the world and still be the poorest person in the room if you've lost the people who actually matter. Real wealth is measured in moments, not bank accounts, in presence, not presence. in the courage to be vulnerable enough to save what's worth saving, even when it would be easier to walk away. That's the lesson Marcus and Rebecca learned on a rainy night when everything fell apart, and somehow, impossibly, began to come back together. That's the truth that saved them both.